The Prix Galien is a welcome initiative to stimulate creative research and promote excellence. Barack Obama. The Galien Awards ceremony is considered the equivalent of the Oscars night for the innovators in the labs and awards every year the best pharmaceutical product, the best biotechnology product, the best medical technology, and the best digital health product.
This is the right event, on the right issue, at the right time.
I thank His Excellency, the President, for bringing Prix Galien to Africa, and I look forward to the day when we will celebrate an African winner of the Prix Galien.
I'm particularly grateful to receive this award.
The awards are among the highest honors in science and commerce because they lead to improvement in the human condition.
The Prix Galien Awards recognize the world's brightest minds and most innovative companies. They are a true celebration of the hard work required to produce life-changing interventions.
That is what makes us optimistic about the future.
Congratulations to all of you.
Make a difference. Join the Galien Foundation.
Welcome to the special Galien Foundation webinar celebrating the best of the very best in this life sciences innovation over the last 50 years. It's a pleasure for me to chair the first of the 5 webinars presenting our 30 nominee products in preparation for what is truly a landmark event, the Prix Galien Golden Jubilee Awards on October 27th at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. There, we will announce the winners of what we consider the single most innovative product brought forward by our industry over the last 50 years in 5 distinctive categories: pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, orphan and rare diseases, vaccines, and medical devices and technologies. Galien is extending its search widely, and for the first time, we'll be including direct input from prominent disease advocacy groups in the US and Europe who represent the true voice of the patient. All told, the Jubilee event represents the most comprehensive assessment of private sector progress in combating disease in the last 50 years. Our focus today will be on the Medtech sector, which has been the focus of my own work as an engineer, an entrepreneur, and now a leader. In that regard, it represents a great opportunity for me and my fellow panelists for the nominee companies here today to reflect on the gains in the industry has made in improving the human condition through medical innovation. Discussion will hopefully shed more light on the challenges of the journey from bench to bedside that each of our nominated products have encountered in their own unique and ultimately successful ways. So not to belabor this, I'm pleased to introduce in turn the 5 panelists representatives and their nominated products. First up is Dr. Shalini Singh, Chief Medical Partner, Oncology at Roche Diagnostics for Cobas HPV Test. Next is Mr. Jared Watkin, Senior Vice President, Diabetes Care at Abbott for FreeStyle Libre system. Third is Ms. YJO, Senior Vice President, THV Global Marketing for the Sapien 3 transcatheter heart valve system. Next is Dr. Kenneth Stein, Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Officer, Rhythm Management and Global Health Policy at Boston Scientific Corporation for their EMBLEM MRI subcutaneous implantable defibrillator. And lastly is Dr. Joseph Coulloc'h, founder and CEO of AAZ for the Autotest VIH HIV at-home testing system. Nice to meet all of you. And we have allocated time for questions from viewers after our panel discussion. Please submit questions anytime in your chat during the webinar. We will try to answer as many as we can. And as they come in, we'll continue fielding questions to the panel. So today we'll talk about a few topics, but the two central themes are going to be all about the past of medical technology innovation. What has the industry accomplished over the last 50 years in making devices and diagnostics more clinically useful and accessible to patients with an increasing range of specialized needs for treatment? And then the second theme is going to be looking forward. In the next 50 years, or if you're not comfortable talking about the next 50 years, however long you're comfortable talking about, 50 years, we didn't know what happened 2 years ago, and now it's 50 years from now. How will new digital platforms, new innovations in Medtech, how are they going to focus on treatment and prevention of patients in the future? What are some of the trends that you're seeing today, and how are those trends going to actualize in the future? So I've asked each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves, talk about their product, and address one question in a series of questions that I'll be asking. So we'll start with Dr. Shalini Singh. And the first question is, why did your company choose to focus on the HPV, or in your case, the detection of human papillomavirus, and how significant was the level of unmet medical need? Dr. Singh?
Yeah, Anatoly, it's a pleasure to be over here, and thanks for the invitation. My name is Shalini Singh, and I'm a pathologist, both anatomic and clinical pathologist, and I'm based in Tucson in Arizona, where it is really hot right now. It's approximately 100 degrees out there. And as for your question, I'll say that Roche Diagnostics decided to focus on it because it was the right thing to do for women. As you know, cervical cancer is the fourth most common cancer in women. In 2020, more than 600,000 women were diagnosed with cervical cancer worldwide, and more than 340,000 women, they died from cervical cancer. Cervical cancer, when it is diagnosed early and it is managed effectively, it is one of the most treatable forms of cancer. And the outlook is very good. In these cases, the 5-year survival rate is approximately 92%. Almost all the cervical cancer is caused by infection by high-risk human papillomavirus, which is a very common virus which is transmitted sexually. And the most of the infections, they resolve spontaneously and they do not produce any symptoms. However, if it persists, it can lead to cervical cancer. Another thing is generally women in low and middle income countries, they are disproportionately affected with this cervical cancer. And that is because of lack of access to diagnosis as well as treatment. And 9 out of 10 deaths, they still occur in these regions. As we know, Pap test has been there to diagnose cervical cancer for many decades, and it has decreased the incidence of cervical cancer. But as a pathologist, I know it that Pap test is very subjective, and it can lead to high false negative test results. And that means is that in some of the women, that the cancer cells may go undetected and it may progress further. So there was a need then to develop new technologies to detect something which can allow us for more sensitive detection of women who have the high risk of developing cervical cancer. So as a result, we developed Cobas HPV test, which is a fully automated molecular test, and it can detect 14 different types of high-risk human papillomavirus. And it also causes to call out separately HPV 16 and 18 genotype. And the reason for that is that they are most carcinogenic compared to other strains. And as a result, the physicians can then focus and give the care to the patient as it is needed. So those were the reasons why we decided to work on it. Thank you.
Dr. Singh, thank you very much for that answer. Next over to Mr. Jared Watkins, same question. Why did Abbott decide to focus on continuous glucose monitor as the product?
Yes, thank you, Anatoly. Thanks for the introduction, and obviously for considering FreeStyle Libre, the continuous glucose monitoring system, for this very prestigious award. I see we're in great company, and it's an honor to be with you all today. So I'm Jared Watkin. I'm the president of Abbott Diabetes Care, based here in the Bay Area. So to your question as to why we decided this was an important space, I think it's no secret that diabetes is a growing problem around the world. It's a global problem. It's estimated today that there are more than 500 million adults worldwide with diabetes, and that number, frankly, is expected to rise to around 780 million by 2045. So those are astonishing numbers. It's a big problem, and that, frankly, doesn't even factor in, those children affected by diabetes across the world. So Abbott has a long history of diabetes work, which is why about 10 years ago, we knew that something needed to change. Every year, millions of people being diagnosed newly with diabetes, and frankly, many more suffering, significant complications and preventable deaths. So we saw an urgent need to change the paradigm in a meaningful way. Now, for people with diabetes, it's critically important that you understand your glucose levels. It's the main, one of the mainstream efforts in terms of managing your condition. And without knowing your glucose level, diabetes can be incredibly hard to manage to avoid the long and the short-term complications, but also obviously potentially fatal. So glucose monitoring is a very important part of that. Now, historically, and we've been in this business, people with diabetes only knew their glucose levels by pricking their fingers to get a reading on a strip and a meter. You've probably seen people do this. Frankly, it was a very important breakthrough, but it's clunky and it's cumbersome, and the pain and the hassle of doing it really limits the number of times people are willing to do it every day, and they're often left guessing or even misguessing about their medication and their food, etc., which can be very important in their health outcome. As an R&D scientist for most of my career, I was always wondering how we could improve this. Going in, our team knew that we had to come up with a less invasive, much more efficient way of allowing those people to collect that much needed glucose data. So what could you do? How could you do this without having to stick your finger, every time you wanted a result? What would the product look like? So from that, we developed FreeStyle Libre. Now, I'd like to say it was that easy. It wasn't. Like all innovation, it was a series of failures along the way to ultimately a success. And we learned, importantly, a lot from those failures, including one of our guiding principles today, which is to innovate for access and affordability. And we firmly believe that the best healthcare technology is the one that helps the most people. So effectively, we tried several times, went back to the drawing board several times, and in the end came up with something that was simple to use, easy, and affordable. And that's how FreeStyle Libre was born. Now, 10 years later, it's now the world's leading continuous glucose monitoring product, and it's worn by about 4 million people around the world every day. I'll just show you what the product looks like. So this is FreeStyle Libre, the latest system, FreeStyle Libre 3. The original was a game changer, and this is our latest version of it. And as you can see, it's a very small sensor that's worn on the back of the arm for 14 days, and that beams the glucose information directly to a smartphone, giving you instant readings, directional movement, and trend arrows, and historical graphs, etc. So it's really the world's smallest and thinnest design, very discreet. People don't really know they're wearing it, and it sends data every single minute to your smartphone, and also alerts you if your glucose level gets too high or too low. So that's really what FreeStyle Libre was designed to do, and addresses a huge unmet need across a very global problem.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's great. What a great looking device, and so small. Nick, the same question goes out to Ms. YJO at Edwards Lifesciences. So YJ, why did your company choose to focus on the transcatheter heart valve, and the patient population that it addresses, and how significant was the level of unmet need? Thanks.
Thank you for the introduction, Anatoly, and representing Edwards Lifesciences. We're thrilled to be a nominee for the Galien Award. It is obviously a very prestigious award recognizing, pushing science forward. And so I'll just start a little bit with what you had asked earlier, Anatoly, is what is our innovation and our focus as Edwards? We are very singular focused on the unmet needs of structural heart and critical care patients. And so the role that I'm responsible for our transcatheter heart valves is predominantly in the aortic valve. And so I'm actually in my hotel room in Paris, where we are based in Irvine, California. But EuroPCR, which is one of the European largest transcatheter conference, has gone in person for the first time in 3 years. So very excited to be involved here with other physicians and scientists and looking at new data presentations. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to get together during COVID, or excuse me, post-COVID. And so one of the things that we're also celebrating this year and at EuroPCR is our year of milestones. The SAPIEN 3 Ultra transcatheter heart valve is in its 4th iteration, and 2022 marks 20 years since the first in-human procedure where proof of concept that an aortic valve could be replaced through minimally invasive transcatheter methods versus open heart surgery was conducted here, actually in France for the first time. And we are also celebrating 15 years of CE mark in Europe and 10 years of FDA approval. And so the unmet need that we service with our transcatheter aortic valve is aortic stenosis. And it does not discriminate against gender. It does not discriminate against ethnicities. It is often mistaken as a disease of the aging, that most people confuse it with being fatigued or getting older. And the truth of the matter is that your aortic valve is stenosing, it's getting smaller. The calcium is not making your heart pump very well. But the diagnosis and the prognosis of someone that has symptoms is not great. So if you develop aortic stenosis, if you do not treat it, and the only way to treat aortic stenosis, which is almost curable, is through aortic valve replacement. But if you do not replace it, 50% of people will die in 2 years. And this was a significant unmet need that Edwards had been in the valve space with surgical heart valves. And so when we came with transcatheter valves, it opened up a completely different opportunity for patients to be treated, for those that could not be treated surgically. And then obviously over the last 20 years, so much data has been generated where transcatheter aortic valves, in particular SAPIEN 3 and SAPIEN 3 Ultra, have been proven superior to surgery. So it gives the patient a larger voice in how they would like to have their aortic valve treated. And I think that's been the important revolution within the medical community, is the role of patient, its role of having medical devices that treat their options. And I think in the disease of aortic stenosis, where it can definitely be addressed and prolong your life when the prognosis is not great when you develop symptoms, is really I would say the motivation and drive for our organization to continue to look for patient-focused innovations, to continue to look at other valves within the heart as a broader aortic, as Edwards Lifesciences. And it is what really has propelled us to continue to innovate in the structural heart space.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you for that answer. Next up is Dr. Kenneth Stein at Boston Scientific Corporation. Same question. Why did your company choose to focus on this disease space? And how significant was the level of unmet need? Dr. Stein?
Yeah, thanks, Anatoly. And I'm also coming to you from a hotel room. Unfortunately, I'm in Washington, D.C. and not in Paris. But it is nice to be getting back to in-person meetings. At Boston Scientific, our mission is to transform lives through providing innovative medical solutions, improving the health of patients around the world. And in that context, I think you have to pay attention to the problem of cardiac arrest or sudden cardiac death. It is the leading cause of mortality across the globe. There are approximately 300 to 350,000 people who die every year of cardiac arrest in the US, approximately the same amount in Western Europe, and the total is millions when you look across the globe. And the issue is, that patients who are unprotected have at best a 1 in 10 chance of surviving a cardiac arrest if it occurs outside of the hospital. But for well over 30 years now, we've had a very effective means of preventing people from dying when they have a cardiac arrest. It's something called an ICD, or implantable cardiac defibrillator, implantable cardioverter defibrillator. And with an ICD in place, actually more than 95% of patients can survive an episode of ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation. The problem with these devices, as anyone who's implanted them, and I was an implanter for many years before joining industry, is that the leads, the wires that connect these devices go into the heart itself and are the weak link of the system. People have approximately 3 million heartbeats every year, and that's a huge amount of mechanical stress on an electrical wire that's connecting a device from the chest into the heart. And so these leads have a relatively high risk of failure over time. And if they become infected, having an infection inside the thorax can be life-threatening. And so the goal in developing the subcutaneous ICD was to create a device that could be as effective as the traditional transvenous ICD at preventing cardiac arrest and sudden death, but avoid all of the complications that are associated with placing leads into the thorax and inside the heart. And in fact, the recent data, actually from a randomized trial that we just presented a month ago at the Heart Rhythm Society meeting in the US, show that we can reduce the risk of complications with the S-ICD from almost 5% with the traditional transvenous ICD to only about 0.5% with the subcutaneous ICD, while being equally effective in preventing sudden cardiac death.
And the last question goes out to Dr. Coulloc'h. Dr. Coulloc'h is from AZ Autotest VIH, HIV at Home Test. Dr. Coulloc'h, same question. Why did your company choose to focus on the HIV at Home test? And how significant was the level of unmet need? And maybe you can give some historical background around there as well.
Thank you. Good afternoon from Paris, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Since 1985, I have found several companies dedicated to the innovation and development of HIV tests. From the first ELISA test for HIV antibody screening commercialized in French blood banks to the first HIV self-test named Autotest VAH in 2015.
Slide 1, please.
At that time, according to the recommendation of the WHO, self-test HIV screening is an extra approach that helps countries around the world to expand access to HIV testing and to reach people at risk or living with HIV who are not diagnosed and who would not get tested otherwise. Autotest VAH is an efficient tool designed for the general population in order to develop self-testing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Coulloc'h. Appreciate that. Perfect. Back over to Dr. Singh. Second question I'd love to ask is, could you tell us a little bit about the measurable impact of clinical outcomes for patients that received your product, specifically the Cobas HPV test? And what's been the clinician response to the product thus far? And I'd love to hear sort of some ideas around the world too. So not just in the United States and Europe, but also in those countries where you say the impact is the greatest. Thank you.
Thank you. So the Cobas HPV test has been the first test which has been approved by the FDA in the US for use as a primary screening test. And in order to do so, we had to perform 2 very large clinical trials in the US. The first one was the Athena trial, and we had to enroll around 48,000 women who were attending the routine cervical cancer screening. And more recently, we have the Impact clinical trial, which enrolled additional 35,000 women. So in both of these trials, primary HPV screening algorithm using our Cobas HPV test proved to be more accurate in identifying women with cervical high-grade pre-cancer than the Pap cytology test. And as a result, it was that we are finding more clinically relevant disease without subjecting more women to diagnostic follow-up procedures. Multiple US and international guidelines now, they recommend HPV primary screening as the test of choice, especially in those areas where we have limited access to testing also. It has been widely implemented and adopted for routine clinical use in many countries across the globe. And several countries like Australia and Netherlands, they've exclusively chosen the Cobas HPV test for their nationwide screening, cervical cancer screening programs also. In August of 2020, the World Health Organization, they released a global strategy, which was establishing goals to accelerate the elimination of cervical cancer as a public health program. And as a result, they had targets from 2020 to 2030. And every country was asked to scale up and introduce HPV screening for women from age like 30 to 49 years of age, and appropriate treatment and follow-up. And their strategy was based on 3 key pillars, which had 3 targets, which are called 90, 70, and 90 targets. That is vaccination, having a target of 90% of girls should be fully vaccinated worldwide by 15 years. Screening of 70% of women, they're screened by high-performing tests. And then treatment should be given to 90% of the women who've been diagnosed with cervical cancer, either for a pre-cancer or invasive lesions, and even including access to palliative care. So based on that, as you can see, this has been a huge impact. And also the clinician response has been very good, as we have had this test now in part of screening guidelines also.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. I appreciate that. Mr. Watkin, same question to you. Is there a measurable impact you can cite on clinical outcomes for patients with this product? And maybe you can talk a little bit about the clinician response as well, especially with the ease of use of implantation and the digital app that accompanies it. Thanks.
Sure, Anatoly. As we said, we work to make the product very simple for people to use, to remove the pain, the inconvenience of finger sticking to get glucose information. And that was obviously very popular move with people with diabetes. Importantly, though, it wasn't just making it easier. The product actually works to improve their overall health outcome. And obviously that's critical for this product to be accepted both by people with diabetes and their healthcare providers around the world. The good news is that we have both traditional clinical trial data that we're all familiar with that shows improvements in health outcomes, but perhaps even more interestingly now, given the scope of the product, the scale, 4 million people using it every day, we're now able to collect significant amounts of real-world evidence as well, gathered from more than 1 million users through that digital app that you mentioned, that shows the impact of FreeStyle Libre in the real world every single day with people with diabetes. So both the clinical trial data and the real-world evidence really shows improved glucose control in people using the product. It lowers HbA1c, which is the gold standard for measuring glucose control at the moment. It actually decreases diabetes-related hospital admissions as well, which is a critical part of the overall health and cost burden of diabetes, and improves the quality of life of the users, removing that pain, that inconvenience, etc. And all at a much more affordable cost than other systems. So we're very proud of the fact that at that affordability, it's spread to all corners of the world, and has that impact not just in the traditional markets where CGMs may have been used, but on a much broader geographic basis as well. A recent independent study done on the system in the UK was just reported a few weeks back, and not only showed the significant health outcome improvements we just talked about, but was actually described by the investigators as one of the most cost-effective health interventions ever studied in the UK. So that the importance of bringing a health product that improves the outcomes of the people using it, but also doesn't burden the healthcare systems, which we all know are very strained with undue cost as well, is something we're very proud of.
Same question to Ms. YJO. What is the measurable impact of on clinical outcomes for patients with this product? And the clinician response to the product thus far. And I want to preface this. There was a comment in a Q&A, and the comment reads, I benefited from an Edwards transcatheter valve. I'm really happy with the results. So a real patient outcome. How wonderful.
Is fantastic. And I actually was going to share a patient story with you. I think I go back a little bit in time with the evolution of how the transcatheter procedure came, because obviously this is a big part of our topic of discussion. As I mentioned before, the only procedure to treat aortic stenosis was open heart surgery. And it is the gold standard to treat aortic stenosis, but it does come with complications and a rehabilitation that is quite lengthy. I think one of the things that really came about from a transcatheter approach, and Edwards was the first to come with this innovation to market, is we looked at how do we best treat the patient. I mean, the cardiac surgeon has the expertise in replacing a valve, but the interventional cardiologists are the ones that have the imaging and be able to have that background, and how do you marry the both? And so one of the things I think that as Edwards, we're really proud about is that we coined and brought together what's called the heart team approach. And it really brought together two specialties that didn't have a lot of overlap previously. And now patients when we first started bringing this procedure to market, it was a procedure that required the cardiac surgeon and the interventionist to sit down, review patients together. We brought in imaging, which started with echo imaging. And as the procedure has improved and been optimized, now we use CT. And I think previously when you used to go in for open heart surgery, you didn't know what you were going to see from a calcium load on the valve. And with all the CT and the imaging, it also brought in echocardiographers to be a holistic approach to treat the patient now and go in and minimally invasively through the femoral artery, treat a patient. I think one of the other things that's phenomenal, if you get a chance to speak to someone that's had a transcatheter procedure, and my very first procedure that I watched, I was amazed to see that a patient no longer needs to be under general anesthesia to get their heart valve replaced. What happens now is they have conscious sedation, and with replacing the aortic valve, usually they have very poor blood flow, they're very gray. When they come into the cath lab, immediately after the aortic valve is replaced, when the SAPIEN 3 Ultra valve goes up, you see the color return into the patient's cheeks almost within a few minutes. And a few minutes after that, the patient is brought back from sedation. They're talking. They are brought to a general ward instead of ICU. The current protocols have been optimized. We have several programs and studies that have developed the best procedure, and that is, again, 4 to 6 hours post-procedure, they're walking. And most often than not, most patients go home the next day. And so to have an aortic valve replacement where the patients go home the next day is an incredible impact from a clinical standpoint. One of the other things, though, that I think is beneficial as we talk about medical technologies is what is the cost impact to society? What is the true impact to the patient? And so through our partner series of trials over the risk stratification that we've had from high surgical risk, intermediate surgical risk, and low risk, which was presented in 2019, is that you get a quality of life benefit from patients as well as a cost savings to the system. So you asked Anatoly, can you talk a little bit about the impact, not just in the US, but in OUS countries? I'll start with US data because that is the one that there's more granular data on. When you look at a patient getting treated with a transcatheter heart valve, there is a system saving of approximately $12,000 to $15,000 that benefits the healthcare system. And the fact that you get an innovation that saves healthcare money as well as impact to patient and improved quality of life is what we call the triple threat, right? Along with the innovation that comes. And it's really rare to get a triple threat success when you bring in medical device technology. And so that's one of the things that we've been able to have validated through the trials. We've also had other health technology assessments around the world. I know in Canada, the OTAC assessment did the very same independent assessment and validation of the impact of transcatheter heart valve procedure, in particular SAPIEN 3, to the healthcare system, and they found the same results. And I think that's ideally from Edwards what we strive for. We want to bring in innovation that not only benefits patients, but also has a significant impact to the healthcare system. Because if you can bring innovation that's also benefits the system, then I think that contributes to an overall healthcare success. And I think the response from clinicians as we brought our iterations have been very promising. We partner very closely with world leaders in this space. They're heavily involved in giving us unmet needs, and that's what is our input for our future design of platforms. And we still feel that there's still a significant amount of unmet needs that we need to go through. I would say in the last 20 years, we've really refined the technical and design impact of how to treat the disease. But where I would say we're just starting is to better understand aortic stenosis. And when we look at how mature the surgical procedure is to treat aortic stenosis, and you look at the fact that TAVR has been available in Europe for 15 years and the US for 10 years, the overall treatment is only at 10%. And so when you look at the fact that only 10% of patients with AS, can be treated, are actually getting treated, there's an opportunity for better patient engagement, therapy awareness, which is really where the cusp of where we are at. And one of the patient stories I was going to share with you, Anatoly, is we are very fortunate that we have strong patient engagement for those that want to continue to learn and want to share their stories to help others. And for the last 10 years, we received a letter from a son of a patient that was treated in one of our very first partner trials. And so this was a woman that was inoperable, was not able to be treated with surgery because she was so frail. She got one of our first iterations of the sapien valve, and she was able to live 10 years past. She was given a prognosis of 1 year of survival, and she lived 10 years. She, her son wrote us a letter every year on the anniversary of her procedure and said that she was able to attend 2 more weddings of her grandchildren, and one of her grandsons decided to pursue a career in cardiology by the impact that our technology had on his grandmother. So you talk about long-term impact and what innovation can truly bring to society. And I think I'm just really proud of what Sapien and obviously Edwards has been able to do in this space.
Thank you. It just brings a smile to my heart to hear, the passion expressed from every one of you. It's really inspiring. Thank you. Dr. Stein, same question to you. And the question is, can you cite some clinical outcome improvements for patients with your product, and also, give us some ideas about clinician response, especially for those implanters, as you mentioned, who had to do a much more difficult surgery than today. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, Anatoly, and I'm glad you asked the question of us, because for innovation to be meaningful, right, it has to meaningfully improve patient outcomes, and the only way to know that, right, is to invest in the clinical trial work necessary to prove the impact that you can have. Since bringing the S-ICD to market, and even as part of the development, we've literally invested tens of millions of dollars in building that kind of clinical trial portfolio, including the first in human studies, the single arm studies necessary to get approval, through to the kinds of prospective registries and real world data, but also funding 2 separate randomized clinical trials to measure, what is the benefit to patients from using this new device. The first of those randomized trials was a global trial called Praetorian, conducted primarily in Europe and the United States, published in the New England Journal during the first year of the pandemic. And Praetorian confirmed in a large multi-center randomized clinical trial that subcutaneous ICD, can be a preferred therapy choice for the majority of patients indicated for traditional ICDs, proved that it offered comparable performance to transvenous ICDs, but also showed that it does help avoid the most serious complications associated with the implantation of a traditional transvenous ICD. In particular, showed that transvenous ICD patients in the study experienced more than 4 times as many lead-related complications as did those getting the S-ICD, and twice as many patients in the transvenous arm had infections serious enough to require actually complete extraction of the device from the patient's body. And then, as I said earlier, those data were really reinforced by a trial that was run out of Canada called Atlas, that was just presented a couple of weeks ago. And in the Atlas trial, again, showed comparable efficacy in preventing death due to cardiac arrest with the subcutaneous ICD, but showed really an incredibly dramatic 92% reduction in serious lead-related complications out to 6 months post-implant. And again, a tenfold reduction in operative complications really is something usually we can only dream about when we're doing invasive procedures in patients. And I think it's the result of this entire clinical trial portfolio that we've been really gratified to see the rapid and widespread adoption of the S-ICD. There are now more than 100,000 patients who have successfully had an S-ICD implant, and it's being used again across the globe in North America, in Europe, in Asia Pacific.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stein. And I'll turn it over now to Dr. Coulloc'h. And same question: is there a measure? Can you state measurable impact on patient outcomes with your product and clinician response to the product thus far? I think there's a slide to go with it as well.
Thank you, Anatoly, for your question. The impact on public health of the introduction of the HIV self-test has been immediate, as the interest from the public health sector has been on both the individual level, since the rapid diagnosis allow access to early treatment, but also on the collective level, to as 30% of people with HIV are still unaware of their HIV status. Following the French launch, many partners all over the world have shown their interest for the distribution of the self-test, which is now available in more than 30 countries, and several millions of people have already been tested with it. 7 years later, thanks to large Autotest VIH availability, HIV self-testing is today very easy and very common in those countries, and the hidden epidemic has started to decrease. Thank you.
Thank you for that. The last question I'd love to ask before we go into discussion is, tell us about the innovation process for your product. Specifically, what challenges did your company encounter in transitioning from an early prototype to human subject testing and ultimately to market authorization? So give us sort of a high-level story about the innovation process, and we'll dive a little bit more into the innovation process as the conversation continues. Dr. Singh?
Thank you. And I would start off by saying, I think at the panel, we have touched on a little bit, already. So clinical validation of any test, any innovative test, and any triage test, or from bench to bringing it to the market, this involves and requires extensive landmark studies, right? To establish that these screening strategies, they can offer improvement. And in our case, it was offer improvement in women's health also. One of the biggest challenge which we had to do was the huge size of the clinical trial, right? And as I've mentioned before, we had one trial, which was Athena trial. We had to enroll 48,000 women. And the other one was Impact, where we enrolled additional 35,000 women. And the reason for this was that there is very low prevalence of cervical pre-cancer and cancer in routine screening population. And the prevalence is approximately only 1%. So as a result, we had to have a very huge clinical trials. Then additionally, we had to follow up these patients for 3 more years to provide the data which was necessary to the regulatory bodies, to the clinicians, to the labs, and even the patients to show that our new test is both safe and effective in identifying women with cervical disease. And as you can imagine, when you have to enroll large number of women, there are a lot of resources which are involved. Cost challenges are there are logistical challenges, and we faced all of those. But what was also different was that there were also societal obstacles also. Even in countries like developed countries where we have organized screening programs, we found out that many women, they're still not aware of the need or even the importance of these cervical screening. And within certain geographic and socioeconomic areas, the prevalence of the cancer is still very unacceptably high. So how to convince those women also to get enrolled in the clinical trials, that was another challenge. Then along with that, as we know, HPV is a sexually transmitted disease. So there were also cultural barriers and other factors which we had to address to raise awareness among the people who were coming and the women who were coming to the clinics also. And one thing which I would also, for us, it was there that we should also not underestimate the impact of a well-established test, which is already there in the market, which is Pap cytology. It has been there for decades. It has data which is already there, and it had a very robust infrastructure around it. So we had to overcome all those challenges to show that our test was more accurate. And so it is, I think something similar will be across all the companies also, or the diagnostics test. I can assume that also. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a really great point. I'd love for the panelists to also touch on the the responsibility of the company to educate both the clinician population and the consumers about the value of the treatment or the need for the treatment in those especially undereducated populations or under populations which may not see the same care as others. And I'd love to turn it over to Mr. Watkin from Abbott. And same question, challenges in early proof of concept to human subject testing, and especially through the lens of education.
Sure, Anatoly. It's a very important question, I think, for all of us. I think we can all recognize there's a difference between a groundbreaking technology and a groundbreaking product. And what we were faced with at Abbott was we had very exciting technology in our first iterations of CGM systems. The first one was called FreeStyle Navigator. But frankly, we weren't able to turn it into a very effective product in the first trial. I mentioned that we had multiple failures where we learned lessons and tried to apply them, but it was all around the core technology of being able to measure glucose in the subcutaneous layer under the surface of the skin. The issue at the time was the product that we originally made was too hard to use. It still required finger sticks to calibrate it, for instance. And I talked earlier about how those finger sticks are so unpopular. So you're asking people with diabetes now to wear something on their body, but also finger stick at the same time. That, you can imagine, didn't go over so well. So one of the things we had to try and make sure with FreeStyle Libre was remove the need for those finger sticks. So you could wear that system on the body without the need for routine finger sticks. And that was a big R&D challenge for us that we took on, but was key to change it from an unsuccessful product to one that was widely accepted. It had to be easy to manufacture. Unless companies like ourselves can manufacture these things efficiently and effectively, they tend to be expensive. So for us, redesigning the product, investing in manufacturing capabilities to allow us to manufacture a product at high volume and therefore low cost was critical. And I said earlier, one of the reasons why FreeStyle Libre has become the #1 continuous glucose monitoring sensor is because it's more affordable. And frankly, that's part of that journey of taking it from a technology into a product becomes very important. Another example, originally CGMs lasted on the body maybe 5-7 days. We were working on FreeStyle Libre. We realized to take cost out of the system, we probably had to make them last longer. I was head of R&D at the time, so that was a challenge, that made me gulp a little bit. But when we brought FreeStyle Libre to the market, it was at 14 days. That halved the number of sensors somebody needs to use every year to wear them continuously. So that translates into a cost advantage. So all those innovations, which were scientifically quite challenging, were also aimed at innovation and, from an accessibility and an affordability perspective as well. So as I said, Libre was not the first product. It was the first successful one that we developed that, managed to reach so many people. But it was built on the back of failures and learnings and success. And I'm sure all the other panelists can relate to that as you move through the innovation cycle. From an education perspective, the point the second part of your question, Anatoly, you're absolutely right. There was enthusiasm for this sort of product, this technology, but did it really, in the end, deliver health outcomes? So educating both people with diabetes and their healthcare professionals, understanding how the data that we collected could then be used to adjust therapy, became a very big part of the education. And how to present this data. We went from a situation with blood glucose monitoring where there was very little data to suddenly potentially overwhelming data, and how you translated that into insight and how you allowed people and the healthcare professionals to understand what it meant and to adjust therapy to improve the health. That was a big educational effort that we took on over a number of years. And we were very keen for that not to be an Abbott situation, but to be a global situation, so that there was a standardized way of looking at glucose control, for instance, reporting it so everybody could understand it. And that was an educational journey for us as well, which involved innovation. So hopefully that's given you a sense of the sort of journey that we went on here at Abbott to bring FreeStyle Libre to the market. And it's one built upon trial, error, learning lessons, and moving forward.
As a builder, I can certainly sympathize with you, and it sounds like it was a very difficult but very rewarding time as well. So congratulations. Ms. O, same question. What challenges did your company confront in transitioning from an early proof of concept to human trials? And I'd love, again, to touch on this education component. How do you connect with the patients and their clinicians and help them understand the need for this sort of device when other treatments are available? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anatoly. So as I mentioned at the start, we're celebrating 20-year milestone of our first in human of the first transcatheter heart valve procedure for the aortic stenosis. And so when we look at, when I wasn't here at the time when that procedure was done. I was very fortunate to come a couple of years after commercialization in the US. But when I speak to my colleagues that we're starting that first procedure, that we're in the cath lab, that we're in the operating room, patients died. And I think that's one of the things about innovation is you don't know if it's going to work. And I think one of the things that I applaud our physicians and our engineers and our leader, Larry Wood, who started our transcatheter heart valve business for Edwards, was let's stop and understand what is happening. What is the best way to proceed? How do we learn what is going on? Because this procedure had never been done. So I think that's one of the challenges and the rewards of being an innovator is you don't have precedents at times to go back on. So you really have to look at every single step of the procedure to understand what the impact of all of that is. Obviously, the team regrouped, and as a result of that, have had 5 New England Journal publications, 10,000 patients studied, to the point now where guidelines around the world have been changed on how to treat aortic stenosis and the best way to view the treatment using transcatheter heart valves. And so, when I look at collectively all the data that's been generated to bring down, down the risk profile for surgery to put transcatheter heart valves on par with surgery, which has been the gold standard for over 50 years, it goes to talk about the importance of generating good, solid, randomized control trial data. And so in 2020, the American College of Cardiology came out with the new guidelines, and for the first time said, patients 65 and older that have AS can now be treated either with surgical or transcatheter heart valve, and the role of shared decision-making patients. So I think you're seeing the evolution of how technology then brings in different guideline changes, and our ESC, which is the European Society of Cardiologists, have also adjusted the guidelines, and we're looking forward to seeing what the Japanese Society will come up with later this year. All of this to say, one assumes that with guideline changes, which is based on sound, strong clinical evidence, it means that the procedure or the technology gets taken up, no problem. And I will tell you, people don't know what the guidelines are. I feel like we should do a Jeopardy and ask physicians or referring cardiologists or patients if they know what the guidelines are to treat their disease. And I would say the level is pretty low. So to your second point, one of the big things that we do within my organization is educate the referring community. I mean, they are so busy trying to understand all heart issues. And aortic stenosis, as I mentioned earlier, is a disease of the aging, and it gets masked as just symptoms as you get older versus an actual disease of the aortic valve. And so we have programs delivered through our medical affairs and through our digital marketing programs to just provide quizzes, online, and education. And our market research indicates that of those that we have surveyed of general cardiologists, only 32% actually know the most recent indications in the guidelines. When we talk to patients, they're not even aware of what transcatheter heart valve is. And so I think a big part of what we're trying to do as Edwards is just raise knowledge across the board of the patient treatment spectrum. So from the patient to understand what their choices are, but ultimately for the physicians to know what the latest technologies are so they can offer the best options for their patients. And so we do spend a lot of effort and time on education. We do a lot of outreach with patient advocacy groups through our public affairs, through our government affairs, but also I have an organization in my team that does patient engagement. And one of the things that we do focus on is the underserviced population. It is one of the things that we see in our data that people of color don't necessarily have access. And so that's one of the things that we're trying to do is how do you bring the opportunity for this treatment to underserviced populations around the world. And even in developed markets, that's a challenge that we see. And so each problem needs a different solution. And so from an education standpoint, I have a group of people that look just at that. How do we reach patients? How do we reach the referring community? And then from an access standpoint, how do we address that situation? Because it's very different for that population base.
Several of your products, and I think probably all of them, are new category products, and category creation is as in product development is the hardest thing to do, and changing hearts and mind takes time. I'll turn this over to Dr. Stein. Same question. What challenges did your company confront transitioning from proof of concept to human subject testing? And because you also have a new category of device, tell us some challenges that you encountered when you are category creating.
Yeah, and I think the important lesson for folks who are listening to this webcast, right, is just to understand how much time and how much in terms of resources, both people resources and financial resources it takes to go from concept to first human use all the way through to approval. And so, for instance, the subcutaneous ICD actually began development in 2001, but we didn't finish the pivotal clinical trial until 2010, didn't get FDA approval until 2012. So that's a total timeline of development for 11 years. And you have to, of course, come over a lot of technical hurdles. You got to build a device, right, that can adequately, reliably sense the cardiac rhythm. You need batteries and capacitors that can charge up to high voltage, deliver a shock when necessary, but also last long enough to be reasonable for a patient. But also, as you say, you also, in addition to developing the product, you have to develop the tools to do a completely new type of surgical implant. And talking about education, right, you have to train implanting physicians in an entirely new surgical approach to implanting a device like this. And, while it turns out you can teach an old dog new tricks, you have to be very thoughtful about it. You have to be proactive about doing it. And it really requires very close collaboration between industry and the engineers and the physicians on the industry side and academic physicians and private practice physicians to get to a point where you really do understand what is the best approach to use, what are the best practices for doing a surgery that no one had ever done before. And I think maybe the bottom line on all that is, it's very personally satisfying to be involved in the development of cutting edge medical technology, but it's not for the faint of heart. It requires a lot of grit, a lot of perseverance, and a lot of passion to get these kinds of products across the goal line.
Thank you. It does feel Sisyphean at times, for sure, but certainly seeing the outcomes there are very endearing to you, I'm sure. Congratulations. Turn the same question to Dr. Coulloc'h. And the question is, what challenges do your company confront in transitioning from early proof of concept to market authorization, and specifically through the lens, I'd love to understand through the lens of education and access. Thanks, Dr. Coulloc'h.
Thank you, Anatoly. There were two main challenges. First challenge, rich people were not diagnosed and would not get tested otherwise. To test yourself in private, a new intervention strategy was needed to diversify the offer of screening. This new device is the culmination of years of work that traces back to the start of HIV testing. It offers the possibility of discrete and confidential screening. It offers additional point of access and provides health professionals, such as pharmacists, with a new role in HIV prevention. Second challenge, make available the most efficient tool for the general population. AAZ has chosen to develop a blood test because the concentration of antibodies in the blood is 1,000 times greater than in the saliva. The uniqueness of this test is that it meets all the criteria of an ideal test. It has a sensitivity of 100% and a specificity of 99.8%. To improve public understanding, Autotest VIH had to be very easy to manipulate, and the result had to be easy to read. The instruction for use had also to be designed by HIV experts in order to give a perfect understanding to the lay user. AAZ invested in a communication and digitization program by developing a smartphone application. With the app, lay users have the possibility to geolocate pharmacies, associations, and testing centers to confirm a positive result. The last very important point is to make its existence known through the support of health authorities. Thanks to the strong investment of the French First Lady, people were convinced to get tested more easily with this innovative device.
Thank you, Dr. Coulloc'h. I'd love to open up the floor for discussion, and any questions from the audience are welcome at this time. I'll ask the first question. So several of you touched on the need to engage diverse populations of patients in both the clinical trial process, but also during the commercialization phase of your products. I'd love to have a few words from each of you about your company's efforts to bring these more diverse populations into clinical trials and commercialization, from a patient education component, but also from a physician education component. And maybe we can start at Dr. Singh, and we can go from there. If a few words, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you, Anton. So as you said, like, how do we bring people from different diversities and include them in the clinical trial, right? So one of the things which we are looking ahead is also improving access into cervical cancer screening also, right? And as I mentioned before, that nobody should die of cervical cancer, because when it is diagnosed early, it's very treatable form. But we also know that most of the cancer occurs in low to middle income countries also, right? And over there, only 15 or to 19% of women, they attend the screening programs. And most of them, they don't. And even in developed countries, approximately, I'll say 63% of the women only attend the screening program. So in order to have them being available, or how can we bring them into the screening programs, we are focusing on two areas. First is self-sampling of cervical specimens. So we are working on that how can the women in their own homes who are not going to the screening clinics, can they send us the samples so that we can have more population being tested so that we can eradicate? And also one thing is there that what we are focusing on this is including those women also, because as for the last 2 years, as you know, pandemic has shown us, right? And many people didn't go to any of these clinics, right? Because of various reasons, health concerns. So how can we bring the test to the patient also? How can we include them? Other thing which we are working on this is something which is called digital tools, right? So in all these countries, low middle income countries, we need to bring the technologies to these people who need them the most. And how do we do that? We are developing a robust infrastructure around it, so that, and digital tools. So that way, whenever the patients have the test, they can easily get the results on their iPhone, and they know what this next steps is, so that they can continue to go back to the clinicians for this screening and potential diagnostic or therapeutic treatments also. So those are the tools which we are developing and focusing on how to bring these people and increase the diversity also.
Thank you. Mr. Watkin, I'd love to hear from you about the digital platforms that Abbott is using in the FreeStyle Libre system, and how that's impacted patient outcomes, and how that's impacted also recruitment of patients from diverse backgrounds.
Sure, Anatoly. Yeah, it's a very important initiative, I'm sure, for all of us. For us, we see the digital tools as a way of democratizing and decentralizing, access to healthcare. And I think we all understand how that can benefit, all parts of the community. Certainly, unfortunately, diabetes has an outsized impact on people of color, for instance, in low socioeconomic status. So we're fully aware of what, the potential impact we have of these products, can have on those populations. And certainly we're embracing that. We're doing work in terms of recruiting future leaders for clinical trial diversity to understand the impact that can have. Certainly the affordable aspect of FreeStyle Libre is part of that, to try and make sure it can reach all parts of the world, as we said, and is not a burden or a barrier to access for us as well. And health equity, and the ability to serve as many people as possible is a core fundamental of what we're trying to do here. And those, to your point, the digital tools are a big part of that. Our digital tools are free. We don't charge for any of those digital tools. And essentially, it allows that information to flow seamlessly from all parts of the population to healthcare providers in an easy way. So we saw that during the pandemic, where unfortunately that we know the pandemic had an outsized impact on people with diabetes, and the ability for that data to be monitored remotely by their healthcare professionals or even their family members. That data from the app I showed you can flow to a healthcare professional. It can flow to a caregiver. So all of those things are part of decentralizing and democratizing the access to data that we think is a key part of the health equity push that we're all involved in.
Well, thank you very much. That's great. I'm sure digital tools are going to be the future of some of our devices. And I'd love to turn it over to Ms. O and specifically ask about maybe there's not so much digital tool use in transcatheter heart valves, but maybe there is a recruitment component of diverse populations, especially underserved populations. Tell us a little bit about what Edwards is doing in that respect.
For sure. And actually, we do have some digital tools that we're looking that we've deployed to help caregivers as an example for it with the patient. But to answer your first question on doing clinical trials for the underserved population, it's the TAVR centers that are in the United States and predominantly in Europe, where the procedure was first brought to commercialization, are in big, large academic centers. And I think one of the learnings that we've gleaned from underserved populations is that it's difficult for them to go to a center where they don't know the physician. And so a lot of these clinical trials are done in centers where they just don't have a relationship with the physician. And so one of the things that we did in our most recent Partner 3 trial was work with physicians in more rural communities where there was an established relationship with communities that we were trying to serve and get better clinical information on how to better treat for aortic stenosis. It was an effort that we put a lot of resources behind. And I would say that one of the learnings from the clinical trial was that there is a big trust issue that needs to be overcome before, I think, from a clinical trial, which is obviously for new products, new drugs, before that's more widely accepted. I think that's probably the biggest thing. So we've embarked at Edwards to start even more upstream to the treatment, but just better understand heart disease and heart health in people of color. And so we've embarked on this study. We're excited to see what the results will be. We don't expect that based on epidemiology studies that we'll be having any aortic stenosis patients. If maybe based on the trial numbers, maybe we'll have 2 patients that require to be treated. We're doing this to start the education in the community of how prevalent is heart disease so that the awareness begins. Before you can begin talking about treatment, you need to bring awareness of the disease to the community. So that's what we're working on. And then to answer the other question about digital health, we've realized that the caregiver plays a big part because our patient population is a little bit older. And so that's one of the ways that we're looking at from an education standpoint is how to engage using digital tools and platforms to help the caregiver understand the disease and the treatment they're about to receive. And that's one of the initiatives that we have for our patient education programs and platforms. And we work with different hospitals to figure out what channels are best appropriate to share that information with. So it's a multifaceted approach. As you know, our earlier question, Anatoly, it is not easy to bring technology and innovation to people. There is a big component of trying to solve for the right question and the barriers for people to seek treatment. And so that's really what we're trying to do.
Thank you. It's, treating these diseases is of course a family affair in many cases, or it involves many stakeholders. Dr. Stein, same question to you. Could you please talk about, especially with your focus on the large clinical trials, some of the efforts that Boston Scientific is currently doing to bring more diverse populations into those trials and eventually, of course, into the usage of the device itself.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to probably echo some of what's been said already. Right, it's critical from a standpoint of just equity, but also from a medical standpoint, just understanding, how do our therapies and devices work in different populations, that we adequately study all the populations in whom those devices and therapies are going to be used. And in cardiovascular medicine in particular, on the whole, we've done a terrible job at enrolling women into our trials in adequate number, in the United States at enrolling African Americans or Latinos or Latinas into our clinical trials. And we are a participant in a multi-stakeholder group. Heart Failure Collaboratory involves industry, academics, regulators, and actually just published what I think is actually a very good white paper looking at strategies to improve enrollment of underrepresented populations in cardiovascular clinical trials. And there's a host of things that we need to do and are doing, right? And it includes globalizing our clinical trials. It includes seeking out sites that do have a good track record of enrolling diverse populations. It includes making sure that our eligibility criteria, inclusion-exclusion criteria don't selectively disadvantage certain populations. Again, for instance, in cardiovascular disease, if you exclude people over the age of 80, you disproportionately exclude women compared to men. It also includes improving the diversity of the people who are conducting our clinical trials and making sure that our investigators, that our steering committees, that our principal investigators are diverse. And optimistic, right, that while no one of these things is going to improve where we are, that doing all of those together will end up getting a much more representative nature of the people who are enrolled in our clinical trials. And I think the other thing that people have talked about again is digital, and it's digital tools within clinical trials. We said earlier, you can teach an old dog new tricks, but old dogs don't like to change quickly. And maybe if anything good comes out of the current pandemic, it is going to be that it will have pushed big medicine, the medical industrial complex, if you will, towards greater use of digital technologies, remote monitoring, virtual patient care, virtual visits. We've done a couple of completely digital clinical trials involving understanding the impact of COVID on some of the physiologic variables that we can monitor through our devices. And I'm optimistic that as we get to greater use again of e-trials, remote monitoring, remote data acquisition, reduce some of the burdens involved for people to participate in clinical trials, we'll do a better job of enrolling more representative population and just a better job overall of getting better enrollment in our trials.
Thank you, Dr. Stein. That was really great to hear about Boston's efforts, but also, the community, the Medtech community, in improving access to these trials, but also the devices themselves. Dr. Coulloc'h, I'd love to ask you a question. Where do you see the next wave of innovation trending in your product area?
The Autotest VIH design could be adapted to other self-tests. That's why we have recently launched a new model with nasal sampling for COVID testing instead of blood sampling for HIV. This new innovation has been particularly designed for child self-testing, and already 4 million young French kids have used it since beginning of 2022. Its development for other respiratory disease is already in progress. This new COVID self-test designed for children will be submitted to the Galien France this year, perhaps. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Coulloc'h. Thank you, Dr. Coulloc'h.
Thank you.
We've come to the end of this panel. I want to thank all of the panelists for sharing their insights. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did too. And This webcast will be available through October on the Galien Foundation's homepage. On behalf of the Galien Foundation, I wish all today's nominees luck and look forward to seeing everyone live and in person on October 27th for the Golden Jubilee Awards event and dinner at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great week.